All your stuff on Lincoln, did Roosevelt ever kind of pop up somewhere there, or could you comment on that?
The question concerns a comparison between Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt as commanders-in-chief during the two biggest wars this country has fought. Similarities, differences. To start out with, Roosevelt, of course, had a great deal more experience. Politically and even militarily, he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. And he probably had the United States Army and Navy, especially the Navy, I think were more highly professional, with better leadership than the United States Army was at the time of the Civil War. So Lincoln, in some ways, faced a more daunting task with less resources in terms of personal experience, and I think probably in terms of government resources, both intellectual and material resources than Roosevelt had. I think Roosevelt had a greater challenge in one way than Lincoln, and that is that he was fighting a coalition war. He had to coordinate American policies with those of the principal allies, Soviet Union and especially Britain. Lincoln did not have to worry about that, but on the other hand, one thing Lincoln did have to worry about, and I didn't really talk about in this lecture, but I've written about it elsewhere, was the possibility of interference in the American Civil War by foreign powers. That at least was not a problem that Roosevelt faced. I think those two, Roosevelt and Lincoln, were the two most successful commanders-in-chief in American history. And they did have some of the same qualities that underlay that success. One was the determination to win no matter what it took. I think second was, and this is highly controversial, especially in the case of World War II, a policy of unconditional surrender. And in fact, Roosevelt really borrowed that idea from the Civil War. No compromise with the enemy. The only way we're going to win this war is to win it. That doesn't necessarily mean that's applicable in all kinds of wars, but in these two particular wars, I think that was the right policy. And I think Roosevelt did understand and appreciate that from his study of history. So I would say that there were both similarities and differences. I suspect in some ways, though, that Lincoln's task was the harder. The resources that he had in terms of professional advice, a powerful economy, although the North didn't have, compared to the Confederacy, a strong economy, were less than Roosevelt had in World War II. But on the other hand, the difficulties of fighting a coalition war, especially with a partner like the Soviet Union, which required delicate handling, was something that Lincoln didn't have to face.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here this evening. I don't want to ask you what you think we should do about Afghanistan, but I do want to ask you, when you read the newspapers currently, and hear the news currently, and you think about, as I'm sure you do, President Obama interacting with military and civilian advisors about that issue, what comes to your mind, having studied Lincoln as a commander-in-chief, so much his interaction with the military and other leaders? I'm interested, what's going on in your brain about this?
Did everybody hear that question through the microphone? Well, I do actually think about that, and things still go through my mind. The main thing that goes through my mind when I read about Obama's the current reappraisal strategy in Afghanistan, for example, is the relationship between politics and the military, and between national strategy and military strategy, as I outlined it in the lecture. General McChrystal in Afghanistan certainly has to be aware of the necessity to maintain political support for the war effort in the United States, but the president is even more aware of that. McChrystal's professional obligations are to recommend a military strategy that he thinks can succeed. But no military strategy can succeed if you don't have national support for the war, as we learned in Vietnam most prominently. But I think we had to relearn it in Iraq and are learning it again in Afghanistan, and that's been true, I think, in all wars. In a way, that reminds me of another Roosevelt-Lincoln comparison I'll get back to in a moment that I didn't mention. So I think what goes through my mind is that just as Lincoln had to deal with the border state, he had to deal with Northern Democrats, he had to deal with the radical wing of his own party, which was trying to push him in a more radical direction on the slavery issue and subsequently on Reconstruction issues. He had to balance all of these political factors with the military situation, and Obama has to do the same thing. And that's what goes through my mind, is that military strategy, or warfighting strategy, let me put it that way, is not solely a military question. It involves a great deal of focus on political questions as well. And the buck stops on the president's desk. He's responsible for making the kinds of decisions that will coordinate these two things. And that's certainly not an easy thing to do. Back to the other question that answering this one reminded me of. Roosevelt had an easier time in maintaining public support for World War II. There was not a significant anti-war movement in the United States in World War II, which is different from almost every other war we fought. There was an anti-war movement in World War I. There's a large number of congressmen voted against the declaration of war, and as we well know, there's an anti-war movement in Vietnam, Iraq, and other wars, Mexican War. Roosevelt didn't have to face that problem, but Lincoln certainly did in the Civil War. And the so-called Copperhead Democrats, whose political strength grew in proportion to the failures of Union military policy. There was a kind of inverse relationship between military success and anti-war opposition. The more successful, the less the opposition, but there were many times during the war when things looked very bleak for the Union cause, and the anti-war movement became quite powerful. In fact, for a while, it looked like Lincoln was going to be defeated for re-election in 1864, on that exact issue. Roosevelt really didn't have to face that kind of thing, which made, again, Lincoln's task even harder, I think.
I might ask you about Roosevelt having George C. Marshall in addition to Reliant, but I won't go there for my real question, which is, can you comment on your use of original source materials and the opportunity and the access you have to original source materials, the extent to which in your research you get to see the actual letters and documents and materials that were written by Grant and Lincoln, and what's that like, and how does that, if at all, play into what you do as historian writing books like this and battle therapy?
Question concerns use of source material and what impact that has, either in this book or in other books that I've written. Well, any historian is really excited to handle the very pieces of paper that the historical subjects that he is doing research about have handled 100 or more years in the past. And I've certainly done that more in my earlier work than now, because many of these things are now available in microfilm for a long time and now on the internet. And if you go to the Library of Congress, for example, to use the Lincoln papers, you don't actually handle the papers anymore, or the McClellan papers, or other kinds of documentation, because they are available in facsimile form. So there's something lost for the excitement of handling the original material by its widespread availability in reproduced form. The Grant papers have been published. The Lincoln papers, of course, have been published. Diaries, valuable diaries like Gideon Wells's diary, John Hay's diary, Senator Orville Browning's diary, sources that were, and others I could mention, that were valuable for me in writing about Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, because they would talk with Lincoln about these. They're all available in published form, edited by skilled scholars, and some of them are not available in the original. So there's something lost in that, even though there's very much gained in terms of convenience and ease in doing this research. So it's a kind of a trade-off. Yeah, back there.
Do you believe that if Lincoln knew at the beginning of the war what the ultimate cost would be, would he have prosecuted the war, or would he look for a non-war solution?
The question is, if Lincoln had known in 1861 the cost of this war, would he have prosecuted it, or would he have looked for some sort of peaceful solution? Well, it's impossible to answer that question. Lincoln himself never really commented on it, except to say by 1864, in public speeches, at a time of the greatest carnage in the war, Grant's overland campaign, the fighting in Virginia in May and June of 1864, he said, "We entered this war for a worthy subject. We undertook this war for a worthy subject, and no matter how much it costs, we're going to go through with it as long as I'm president." That indicates to me that after 3 years and hundreds of thousands of deaths, he thought it was worth the cost. But that doesn't really address your question. If he had known back in 1861, what would he have thought? He certainly would not have consented to a compromise that recognized the legitimacy of the Confederacy. And almost any compromise after those first 7 states seceded would have required him to do so. So my feeling is that having come to the conclusion that he could not preserve the United States as one nation by anything short of war, he was determined to do it even at the cost of war. But of course, he couldn't know what that cost would be in 1861. Neither he nor just about anybody else anticipated 620,000 war dead, the destruction of billions, literally, and today, of course, much more than that, billions of dollars worth of property and resources in this war. But by 1864, it had become clear what the cost of this war was, and he did express that determination to go through no matter what it cost. Yeah. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I was wondering if you could expand, because each president, when they fight a war, has to expand on that role of commander-in-chief and kind of stretch it to meet their purposes. So how did Lincoln change the role of commander-in-chief to meet his policy goals?
The question is, every president has to shape the role of commander-in-chief to fit the situation. I think that's what you're saying. And how did Lincoln do that? Well, Lincoln certainly expanded the powers of the president as commander-in-chief beyond any previous president and set precedents for the future. I didn't really talk very much about that in the lecture this evening. I did talk about it quite a bit in the book, Tried by War. Lincoln said in his first message to Congress, he used the phrase twice, war power. And he said that the commander-in-chief clause of the Constitution gave the president whatever powers necessary to to fulfill his role as commander-in-chief, he was the one who really came up with this concept. The Constitution itself says nothing about the president's powers as commander-in-chief in wartime. It merely says that the president is commander-in-chief. So Lincoln really created these war powers. And he went beyond what any previous president had done. For example, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus early in the war and got into a conflict with the Chief Justice of the United States about that, who said the president could not do that on his own authority, that he must have congressional authorization to do that. But Lincoln said, this is part of my war powers as commander-in-chief. His Emancipation Proclamation was an exercise of the war powers as commander-in-chief to seize enemy property being used to wage war against the United States, but that was Lincoln's own definition of his war powers. He arrested, under the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, some 15,000 people, most of them in the border states, which were active war zones during much of the war, were arrested and kept in what we would today call preventive detention. And he also authorized in a proclamation of September 24th, 1862, just 2 days after the Emancipation Proclamation, martial law and military tribunals to try civilians, again under the war powers. So many things that are familiar to us today as controversial exercises by the president of war powers, most recently, of course, by the Bush administration, but some of them continued by the Obama administration, were really pioneered by Lincoln and have constituted precedents as a result of that. And in many ways, these were the most controversial things that Lincoln did as commander-in-chief. But he did so under the plea of military necessity to win the war, and that included the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah.
Could you comment on some of the sources that Lincoln may have drawn upon to develop his familiarity with military matters, his knowledge of military strategy and tactics?
The question is, what were some of the sources that Lincoln drew on to learn more about military matters? We know that he personally checked out from the Library of Congress a couple of Halleck's books. General Halleck had written a kind of he translated Antoine Jomini's book on military strategy based on Jomini's studies of Napoleon's campaign. Halleck himself wrote a book on military strategy. It's kind of ironic because Lincoln found himself quarreling on that question with Halleck on more than a couple of occasions. We don't know some of the other things that Lincoln read. What we have is John Hay's comment, who lived in the White House, saw Lincoln every day for several hours each day, talking about Lincoln burning the midnight oil, reading works on military history and strategy. But unfortunately, Hay doesn't say what they were. And that's been one of the more frustrating things for me and for other people who have studied Lincoln as commander-in-chief to know exactly what he was reading. We only have glimpses of some of them. He refers to Napoleon, who was, the great practitioner in the minds of the 19th century, of the great example of military genius. We know that Lincoln read about Napoleon's campaigns, but we don't know exactly what he read about Napoleon's campaigns because he refers to Napoleon sometimes in talking about military strategy and operations. So I wish I could answer that question more definitively. All we know is that he really did work on it. Yeah.
Yeah, Professor, with the election of President Obama and his fondness for Lincoln and the noted recent birthday of Lincoln, there seemed to be a reemergence of Lincoln in the press and the media, and some debates that seem to be a little more prevalent in the press. And part of the debate seemed to be on Lincoln as the great emancipator, but also Lincoln not perhaps seeing the importance or having the desire for equality for African Americans. I just wanted to see kind of where you were on that and your feelings on Lincoln on those two issues.
Question concerns all of the comments about the relationship, Obama's interest in Lincoln and the kind of connections between Obama and Lincoln. But what about the issue of Lincoln's views of race? Well, Lincoln was a product of his time. He was born in Kentucky and brought up in southern Indiana, very race-conscious parts of the country. He was unusual for people from that kind of background in his early and consistent and unwavering hostility towards slavery, but not untypical in his convictions of white supremacy. But some of those expressions were forced from him in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, particularly when Douglas played the race card over and over again, charging Lincoln and the Republicans with being Negro worshipers in favor of black equality, in favor of freeing all the slaves in Missouri and having them cross the Mississippi River and come into Illinois and marry all their daughters, and all that sort of thing. Douglas did that. And much of what we have in terms of Lincoln's expressions of his own racial attitudes is a response to this kind of race baiting by Douglas in a state like Illinois, where that's the kiss of death if you stand accused of that and the voters believe it. But the key thing about Lincoln, in my perception, is that he was flexible on this and that he was moving far beyond that kind of position by the middle of the Civil War. He started out being in favor of colonization of the freed slaves to diminish the racial friction that he was afraid would result from emancipation. If he can convince a lot of these freed slaves to immigrate to Central America or to Haiti or to some other tropical society, he supported that policy in the first year and a half of the war. But he moved beyond that, and I think the main reason he moved beyond that is once he made the commitment to recruit black soldiers to fight for the Union, it became clear that you can't ask these people to fight for their country and then deny them citizenship in the country and equal citizenship. And by 1863, Lincoln, who repeatedly praises the contribution of black soldiers, and I quoted a couple of them here, has changed his mind on that, or is beginning to change his mind on that. No more talk of colonization. Now it's a question of what kind of rights will the freed slaves have, and how will we move toward that achievement. And by the end of his life, he's talking about equal rights, equal voting rights, equal civil rights for all of those blacks who had fought, and their families fought for the United States. But that's going to be a step toward even more. And he hints at that in the last speech he gave. And in fact, when he gave what turned out to be, he didn't know it was going to be his last speech, obviously, about Reconstruction on April 11th, 1865, 2 days after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, he gave a speech from White House balcony. And in the crowd, and he talked about announcing a new policy on the rights of former freed slaves in the Reconstruction process. And in the crowd was John Wilkes Booth, who turned to Lewis Powell, who was one of his Confederates and the one who attacked Secretary of State Seward and nearly killed him when Lincoln was assassinated. And Booth said, he snarls, "That means nigger citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he'll ever make." So it can be plausibly argued that Lincoln's progressive movement toward liberal civil rights policy for the freed slaves is signed his death warrant. And that also is an indication of how far he'd come in the past 7 years since his statements in the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
Thank you for being here tonight. It's always seemed to me that there's a great change in the perception of how the nation views Lincoln after his assassination. I'm not sure Lincoln would have maybe looked at the same path.
Question concerns how we would view Lincoln today if he had not been assassinated. Well, and if he had lived to face the same kinds of problems in Reconstruction that nearly brought down Andrew Johnson as president. He was impeached and saved from conviction by a single vote in the Senate because of his stubborn resistance to the Republican congressional Reconstruction policy. Well, two parts to the answer to that question. First, there's no doubt but that the martyrdom of Lincoln has a huge amount to do with our image of him as the great war president and the emancipator, the savior of the Union, the freeing of the emancipator of the slaves. He still would have had that historical reputation, and still would, if he had lived on. We can't know exactly how things would have played out in Reconstruction, except that I don't think they would have gotten anywhere near as bad in terms of the poisonous atmosphere in Washington that occurred under Andrew Johnson. But I think the martyrdom of Lincoln on Good Friday, by the way, at the moment of victory, has done a great deal to shape our image of him as this almost superhuman but tragic figure. And probably we wouldn't have that same image of him had he lived out his biblical 70 years, which would have meant he died in 1879. But dying the way he did has created something that no other. I suppose in a way Kennedy would be the comparable. I think part of the Kennedy image is the result of the assassination too, and the same thing I think is true of Lincoln. On the question of Lincoln's image if he had lived through Reconstruction, we can't know, but one thing I can be sure of, I think historians can be sure of, that things wouldn't have gotten as bad as they did in the breakdown of Johnson's relationship with Congress and the poisonous atmosphere that created for the whole Reconstruction process. Johnson defied all of the Reconstruction policies of Congress. They had to pass all the legislation over his veto. He did his best for non-enforcement of that legislation. He held out hope to Southern whites that they could resist the Reconstruction policies that granted civil rights to the freed slaves, eventually the voting rights to the freed slaves, because they had the President of the United States on their side. That would not have happened with Lincoln. I think we can be sure of that. Whether he would have been as successful in Reconstruction as our image of his success in war and emancipation is another question, and probably he wouldn't have been. It was the kind of problem that might have defeated any president, just because of the very difficult nature of that problem. And so our historical image of him probably wouldn't be quite so high as it is, because he was martyred at the moment of victory. One more question. Yeah.
Current students of American history and the Civil War and the Lincoln era hold you in high esteem as one of America's leading scholars in this field. Who are the scholars and the historians that have come before you that you would place at that level?
Well, I had a great deal of admiration for Ellen Nevins's work on the Civil War, and Nevins was a kind of Renaissance man because he wrote about many other things as well. An extraordinarily prolific and a wonderful writer. I admired his stuff a great deal. My graduate school mentor, C. Van Woodward, who was primarily an historian of the South, but also wrote some very penetrating things about slavery, emancipation, the Civil War, was somebody, I think, a giant in the field as well. In terms of the military history of the Civil War, I think Bruce Catton stood very high in his time. T. Harry Williams, whom I mentioned, also stood very high as a Civil War historian. And also won a Pulitzer Prize for a biography of Huey Long, so he had other strings to his bow as well. So these are some of the very prominent historians who have inspired me and whose work I have a great deal of admiration for.
Well, that ends the formal part of the proceedings, but there are light refreshments for the multitudes, I believe, in the back. And Professor McPherson said he would be happy to sign books, which I think will be out in the hallway out there. So thank you all for coming.